Have you noticed how when something inside you hurts, your mind instantly looks away? It distracts you, justifies, changes the subject, anything to avoid the sting of seeing what's real. Yet what you refuse to look at doesn't disappear. It grows in the dark, shaping your choices from beneath awareness. What if the very thing you avoid observing is what controls your life the most? Today we'll explore the hidden power of the observer, the quiet intelligence within you that sees what the mind hides. Because when you learn to truly observe, illusion loses its control. But before awakening that clarity, you must first understand the single mistake that keeps even sincere seekers trapped for years. The first mistake doesn't come from ignorance, it comes from too much knowing. From the endless reading, the meditations tracked by apps, the mantras repeated without truly listening, the mind learns to sound spiritual long before the heart learns to see. It's subtle. You begin to speak about awareness, detachment, and vibration. You understand the theories, observer and observed, ego and self, as if they were pieces on an intellectual chessboard. But while the mind collects ideas, the real observer remains silent, waiting to be noticed, not described. Here's the paradox. The mind loves talking about awakening, but it's terrified of experiencing it, because the moment awareness becomes direct, the mind loses its central role. And so, it keeps you busy analyzing what being the observer means, instead of simply observing. Notice this right now, the subtle movement inside you that wants to grasp what I'm saying. That tightening, that effort to understand, is the mind doing what it does best, turning living truth into concept. But observation is not a concept, it's a living act. Imagine this, you're looking through a window at the rain. You can describe the rain, its rhythm, its sound, the way it falls, or you can just see it. The first engages the mind, the second engages awareness itself. One builds distance, the other dissolves it. That's the first mistake of the spiritualized mind. It confuses talking about the window with looking through it. The mind tries to capture the observer like a photograph, a fixed image it can store and recall. But the observer is not something you can capture. It's the clarity behind every thought, the stillness in which every movement happens. The mind wants to possess this stillness, but possession is impossible because the one trying to own it is what must be observed. When you notice this loop, something loosens inside. You don't need to stop thinking. You only need to see that the thought isn't you. The mind becomes a passing landscape, sounds, words, fragments of old emotions, and you're simply there, aware of it all. Take a moment to test this directly. Close your eyes if you can, and observe the next thought that arises. Don't analyze it. Don't push it away. Don't label it as spiritual or mundane. Just notice it forming, peaking, and fading. Stay with the movement. Now ask silently, who is noticing this thought? Don't rush for an answer. Let the question hang in the air like incense. You might sense a gap, a quiet, alert presence that doesn't need to say a word. That presence isn't new. It has always been here, watching the mind perform its dance. That's the first taste of the observer. Not as an idea, but as direct experience. No belief required, no technique needed. And yet the mind will try to steal this moment too. It will whisper, "Ah, now I understand. I am the observer." It claims ownership of awareness and turns it into another identity, the one who observes. This is how the ego survives even inside spirituality, by wearing the mask of consciousness itself. That's why so many seekers spend years circling the same insight. They believe they've found stillness, but it's only the mind's reflection of it, calm on the surface, restless underneath. If you can see this play without judgment, something more honest begins to unfold. The real observer doesn't claim, compare, or perform. It doesn't need to be right or awakened, it simply is. And from that quiet seeing, a deeper question begins to rise, one that no book or teacher can answer for you. If I'm not the one thinking these thoughts, then who am I? That question marks the threshold between knowing about awareness and actually living from it. But the mind resists this threshold. It fears losing its identity as the thinker. the controller of reality. So it creates 1,000 subtle distractions to keep you within its boundaries, a gentle prison, made of concepts and good intentions. This is where the next illusion begins to form, the trap of identification, where the mind, desperate to keep its role, makes you believe you are it, and unless this is seen directly, you'll keep trying to awaken through the very thing that keeps you asleep. Every moment you think, "I am thinking," something subtle but profound happens. You merge with the movement of the mind. You don't just experience the thought, you become it. The statement, "I am angry," "I am afraid," "I am not enough." Each one forges a temporary identity, like a mask worn so long that you forget there's a face beneath it. Identification is the oldest trick of consciousness. It makes the invisible actor forget it's on a stage. The thought appears, emotion follows, and the sense of me fuses with both. You feel as though the storm of inner noise defines who you are, when in truth, it only passes through you. It's not your fault. The human brain evolved to equate thinking with existence. Neurologically, each thought lights up the same networks responsible for self-recognition. So the moment a thought arises, the body believes, "This is me." The identity is not just mental, it's biochemical. Your pulse quickens, muscles tighten, hormones surge, all because the mind whispered a phrase and the body obeyed. But there is another layer of perception, the one that sees the thought rather than being the thought. The shift is delicate, almost imperceptible at first. It's the same kind of difference between being trapped inside a movie and sitting back to watch it. The scenes still play, the emotions still move, but you know they are not you. Pause for a moment and test this directly. Notice a single thought passing by, maybe a plan, a worry, a fragment of commentary. Don't analyze it. Just notice its texture, its tone. Then ask quietly, "Who is hearing this thought right now?" Stay very still. You might feel a flicker of spaciousness, as if something behind the thought is silently aware of it. That awareness doesn't think, it doesn't argue, it doesn't even need to understand. It simply observes. The moment you glimpse that, identification loosens. You are no longer the storm, but the sky holding it. And yet the trap is persistent. The mind doesn't surrender easily because its survival depends on attachment. Every thought says, "I am important. Without me, you are nothing." The ego thrives on this equation. Confusion equals existence. If you ever stop believing your thoughts, the illusion begins to dissolve. So the mind fights back with more noise, analysis, self-criticism, spiritual performance. You can even identify with the observer itself, the spiritual self that watches everything, but subtly believes it's superior to those still lost in thought. That too is identification wearing a subtler robe. The mind turns awareness into another persona, one that seeks validation through its very non-attachment. The trap of identification is not just mental, it permeates relationships, work, spirituality. You say, "I'm the helper, I'm the achiever, I'm the wounded one." These identities offer temporary safety because they give you a role to play. But roles are masks, and the longer you play them, the harder it becomes to remove them. You start defending the mask as if it were your own skin. Here's the strange beauty of it. When you begin to notice identification in real time, you don't need to force it to stop. The simple act of seeing it, honestly, without resistance, already weakens its grip. The light of observation is what the illusion fears most. Take this next moment as a small experiment. Let a familiar self-definition arise. Perhaps "I'm the one who overthinks," or "I'm the one who can't stay calm." Feel how that sentence lands in the body. Where does it contract? The chest, the jaw, the stomach. Stay with the sensation, not the story. Notice that the identity is felt, not just thought. Now, without changing anything, become aware of the awareness noticing it. Something wider is holding that identity, quietly, effortlessly. That vastness has no name, no age, no story. It's not personal. This glimpse is fragile at first. The mind will quickly try to reclaim it, saying, "Yes, I see, I am awareness." But listen closely. Even that statement is another thought arising within awareness, not the other way around. The mind cannot own what was never separate from it. Identification dissolves in proportion to your willingness to see without trying to fix. Each time you notice a thought without merging with it, you reclaim a little space where peace naturally exists, not as an achievement, but as your original state. And here lies the quiet irony. Once you stop believing that every thought is you, the thoughts themselves begin to relax. They no longer need to shout to be heard. Some fade completely. Others become transparent, like words on a window. But this new clarity leads you to a deeper discovery, a truth that's harder to face. Because once you see that you are not the thought, the next question arises. Why does the mind work so hard to keep you identified? What is it protecting? That's where the next veil begins to show itself, the one built not from belief, but from avoidance. The escape mechanism that hides discomfort the same way a child hides under a blanket, hoping the storm will pass without being seen. Every human being has a silent reflex that activates the moment discomfort appears. It's almost biological, an instinct older than language. A tightening in the chest, a rush in the mind, and before you can even register it, you're already reaching for an escape. A thought, a justification, a distraction. Anything that can move you away from the raw texture of what you're feeling. The mind is a master of avoidance. It doesn't want to face the unease that lives beneath its stories because discomfort threatens its illusion of control. When something painful stirs, it rushes to fix, explain, or hide it. You feel anxious and instantly the mind begins to search. What caused this? How can I stop it? Who is to blame? It doesn't realize that in doing so, it reinforces the very discomfort it's trying to escape. Every justification is a wall, and every distraction is a door that leads back into the same room. You think you've run away from pain, but you've only carried it with you, disguised in new words, new habits, new identities. Look closely at your own escapes. They're often invisible because they wear the costume of productivity, spirituality, or care. You might open a self-help book, meditate to calm down, scroll through your phone, or immerse yourself in work. None of these actions are wrong on their own. What matters is why you do them. If they're attempts to turn away from discomfort instead of turning toward it, they become mechanisms of avoidance. Try something for a few seconds. Bring to mind a small situation that recently unsettled you. Perhaps someone's tone, a decision you regret, an expectation unmet. Feel the subtle resistance that appears in the body. Maybe the throat tightens or the stomach contracts. Don't analyze it. Just notice the raw sensation. Now observe the impulse to move away, to distract yourself, to interpret, to soothe. That impulse is the escape mechanism. It's the mind saying, let's not stay here. It's too much. But is it really too much? Or has the mind simply never learned how to stay present with what it doesn't control? When you resist discomfort, you create a loop. Pain, avoidance, momentary relief, deeper pain. The energy that was meant to move through you becomes trapped, circulating endlessly in the background. This is why suppressed emotions often return as fatigue, tension, or anxiety. What the mind avoids doesn't disappear, it hardens. Observation changes this dynamic completely. The moment you bring awareness to the avoidance itself, not just the pain, but the act of running from it, something unexpected happens. The movement slows. The emotion begins to unfold instead of being chased away. You start to see the escape mechanism as it activates, and in that seeing, its power weakens. This is where the practice of conscious observation becomes essential. You're not trying to fix the discomfort or make it vanish. You're simply acknowledging that it's there and allowing it to exist without judgment. It's like opening a window in a closed room. The air doesn't become perfect instantly, but it begins to move again. Notice the body right now, the subtle micro-reactions. Maybe a breath becomes shallow or a shoulder tenses. These are the physical signatures of avoidance. When you become aware of them, you begin to reclaim territory from the unconscious. The observer in you is not trying to stop the escape. It's shining light on it. Sometimes the mind uses more sophisticated disguises. It can even hide inside spiritual practices. I'm above this emotion. Everything is illusion. There is no self to suffer. These statements can sound wise, but often they're just refined versions of the same flight response, running away from the intensity of human feeling under the banner of enlightenment. It's not the discomfort that causes suffering. It's the refusal to feel it. The emotion itself is never the enemy. Anger, fear, grief, they are movements of energy asking to be acknowledged, not eliminated. When you allow them to be fully seen, they transform on their own. The heat of anger reveals unspoken boundaries. The ache of sadness exposes what truly matters. Avoidance, however, freezes this natural transformation. It turns emotion into a frozen memory, a pattern that repeats until you're willing to face it directly. Every avoided feeling becomes an unfinished conversation between your mind and your deeper self. So, the next time you sense yourself running toward a screen, a story, a rationalization, pause. Ask gently, what am I unwilling to feel right now? The question is not meant to analyze, it's meant to invite, to stay. And here lies the subtle danger. If you don't see these mechanisms clearly, you end up living as a hostage to the emotions you try to avoid. Each avoidance strengthens the illusion that safety lies in escape, when real safety lives only in awareness. But something powerful happens once you begin to face what you've spent years avoiding. Observation without judgment starts to act like light entering a dark room. The fear doesn't need to be fought anymore. It begins to dissolve in clarity. That's where the shift begins, when you realize that observation itself is not passive, it's transformative. To observe without running is to turn on the light within, and the moment that light touches what was hidden, you begin to sense another power, a neutral awareness that doesn't fight with the mind, but quietly reveals what's real. That's where we move next, into the power of neutral observation, where seeing replaces resistance and light begins to do what effort never could. Imagine you walk into a dark room. For a moment, shapes are threatening, shadows seem alive, and every sound feels dangerous. Then someone switches on the light and suddenly what looked like a monster is just a chair. What felt like danger is only silence returning to its natural stillness. That simple act of illumination is what neutral observation does inside the mind. It turns the light on. Neutral observation isn't a technique, it's a stance, the capacity to see what's happening without trying to alter it. The mind believes that to fix discomfort, it must interfere. But awareness doesn't fix, it reveals. And revelation itself is the beginning of transformation. The difficulty is that the mind doesn't know how to stay neutral. It has been trained to evaluate everything, good or bad, right or wrong, progress or failure. This constant judgment creates turbulence in perception. Every inner movement is labeled before it's truly seen, and what's labeled can no longer be fully known. Neutral observation removes that interference. It asks you to look without adjectives, without conclusions. When a feeling arises, instead of calling it fear, you simply notice the quickening pulse, the shallow breath, the contraction in the body. You observe the pure phenomenon before the story attaches to it. The story may still appear, but the observer no longer merges with it. Try this for a moment. Bring your attention to the rhythm of your breathing. Don't deepen or slow it. Let it be exactly as it is. Notice the sensation of air entering, the subtle pause, the air leaving. Now become aware of the part of you that is watching the breath. That awareness isn't breathing, it's simply perceiving. It doesn't comment, it doesn't strive, it just sees. That's neutral observation, perception without participation. The mind fears this neutrality because it feels like losing control. It believes that without judgment, everything will collapse into chaos. But neutrality doesn't mean indifference. It means alignment with what is, before the mind edits reality to match its preferences. The observer isn't cold or passive, it's profoundly alive because it allows reality to reveal itself in its purest form. When you stay neutral long enough, the structure of emotion begins to change. You notice that feelings aren't solid, they're waves. They rise, peak, and fade naturally when left alone. Most suffering comes not from the emotion itself, but from the resistance to its movement. Judgment traps emotion, observation frees it. Scientists studying attention have found a similar pattern. When the brain is allowed to observe sensations without assigning value, stress circuits deactivate and areas linked to clarity and empathy light up. In simple terms, the nervous system relaxes when it's no longer forced to react. What looks like a mystical state is actually a physiological return to coherence. In everyday life, this power becomes visible in subtle moments. Someone criticizes you, and instead of defending or collapsing, you feel the surge of heat in your chest, the impulse to react. And you just see it. You don't suppress it, and you don't act on it. You let it unfold. Within seconds, the energy shifts. The emotion was never the enemy, the unconscious reaction was. The same applies to fear. When fear is observed neutrally, its edges soften. You begin to sense that fear isn't trying to destroy you, it's trying to protect you. But it doesn't know how to do that wisely. Observation translates fear's raw intensity into information. Something matters here. Pay attention. Neutral observation also changes how you relate to thought. Instead of wrestling with the mind's noise, you start to notice the tone and speed of thinking. Sometimes sharp and frantic, sometimes slow and heavy. You see that thought is just another weather pattern moving through awareness. It doesn't require obedience. This shift is liberating because it restores perspective. The observer sees that thoughts and emotions are transient expressions, not definitions of self. The same awareness that witnesses anger can witness peace. What you are is not the content of experience, but the capacity to experience at all. For a few seconds, try to sense that capacity right now. The awareness that is reading these words is not a thought. It's the space in which thoughts appear. It's open, silent, untouched by what it observes, and yet it allows everything to exist. In that spaciousness, something remarkable happens. Clarity arises naturally. You don't have to force understanding. Insight emerges on its own. Just as water clears when you stop stirring it, the mind reveals its depth when you stop judging its surface. There's a quiet relief in this, the realization that you don't need to control your inner world for it to find harmony. Observation does the work that effort never could. The more you see clearly, the less there is to fix. But this realization brings with it a strange paradox, one that confuses many seekers. Because once you experience the ease that comes from simply observing, a question arises. If peace comes from not resisting, then why does looking at pain sometimes feel unbearable? Why does awareness seem to intensify what we were trying to understand? That's the paradox of healing, that freedom doesn't come from escaping pain, but from meeting it completely. And the next layer of understanding begins right there, where the observer learns to face what the mind has always feared to feel. Healing at first glance seems to mean removing pain. We imagine a clean slate, no wounds, no noise, no lingering echoes of the past. But the deeper you go, the clearer it becomes. Healing doesn't erase what hurts, it transforms your relationship to it. The paradox is that freedom begins not when pain ends, but when you stop running from it. The human mind, conditioned by survival, has learned to treat pain as an enemy. Physically, that makes sense. You avoid the flame because it burns. Emotionally, though, this instinct backfires. When you try to flee from inner discomfort, fear, grief, shame, the very act of avoidance keeps it alive. You push it down, and it burrows deeper, waiting to surface in disguised forms. Irritation, fatigue, the vague heaviness you can't name. Pain wants to be witnessed, not glorified, not dramatized, just seen. And this is where the paradox lives. You cannot free yourself from what you refuse to feel. Observation, the same neutral presence you discovered before, becomes the doorway through which the pain finally transforms. Imagine a tightly coiled spring. Every time you avoid an emotion, you add another turn to that coil. It becomes denser, harder to touch. But when you sit with it, not analyzing, not labeling, simply allowing, the tension slowly unravels. The energy that was locked in resistance begins to move again. That movement is healing. It's the body remembering its own intelligence. The process feels counterintuitive. The moment you decide to face what you've always avoided, the discomfort often intensifies. That's because awareness amplifies what it touches, not to torture you, but to reveal what's been hidden. The mind interprets this as regression. I'm getting worse. But in truth, it's the first real movement toward freedom. When you stop fighting pain, something unexpected appears beneath it, a quietness that was never wounded. That quietness doesn't belong to the mind, it belongs to awareness itself. It watches the waves of emotion rise and fall, knowing they are transient. From that perspective, pain loses its narrative. It's no longer my pain, it's simply sensation passing through space. There's a point in this process when the mind panics. It says, if I stop resisting, I'll drown. But the opposite happens. Resistance is what keeps you underwater. The moment you let go, you float. This doesn't mean surrendering into passivity. It means staying conscious inside the feeling, allowing it to complete its cycle without interference. Emotional energy wants to move through, not be analyzed. When you stop judging it as wrong, you make space for its message. Fear might reveal a boundary you ignored. Sadness might point to something precious you've neglected. Every emotion, when allowed, delivers a truth. And yet here's the danger. The mind, realizing that facing pain feels powerful, starts performing it. It begins to turn awareness into another goal. If I look deeply enough, I'll finally get rid of this. But healing isn't about intensity. It's about honesty. You don't need to dig. You need to stop pretending. Sometimes, what heals fastest is the simplest act. Sitting quietly and saying inwardly, yes, this too. That small gesture of acceptance changes everything. It doesn't make the pain pleasant, but it restores your relationship with what's real. And what's real can always move toward balance. When awareness embraces pain, instead of rejecting it, the cycle of resistance breaks. You begin to notice that the pain itself is finite. It comes in waves, then quiets. What's infinite is the awareness that observes it. That realization doesn't just ease suffering, it redefines what you are. Because if you are the one who can witness pain, how could you be the pain? If you can see the emotion arise and fade, then what you are must be something larger than both. And the deeper that truth roots in you, the less fear pain holds. It becomes what it always was, a movement through consciousness, not a flaw in it. Still, this understanding isn't a one-time revelation. The paradox of healing is lived moment by moment, in each decision to stay open when the instinct says close, to breathe when the impulse says run. It's the quiet courage of letting truth hurt where lies used to protect. So here's something to try. Next time an emotion you dislike begins to surface, don't rush to fix it. Pause, place a hand over your heart if that helps, and whisper inwardly, show me what you're trying to say. If that simple sentence touches something real in you, if it stirs a quiet recognition, let it echo for a while. And then, as a living reminder, share it. Write in the comments, I'm ready to feel what heals. Let those words mark the moment you stopped running and started observing, not as a confession of pain, but as a declaration of awareness returning to itself. Because that's how the transformation begins, not with escape, but with the gentle willingness to see. And as that seeing deepens, it opens into something even more profound. The realization that the mind was never the enemy at all, only a tool waiting to be guided by the awakened observer within. There's a precise instant, small, almost imperceptible, when the balance shifts inside you. It doesn't come with music or light. It arrives quietly, often in the middle of something ordinary, washing dishes, driving home, waiting for an answer that never comes. You notice a thought rising, feel the familiar pull to identify with it, and then something in you simply sees it, not as an enemy, not as truth, but as movement passing through. That's the moment of internal revelation, the split second when awareness recognizes itself as separate from the noise of the mind. It's not dramatic, it's disarmingly gentle. The same thought that once dragged you into hours of reaction now appears like a cloud drifting across a wide sky. The cloud is still there, and the emotion, the memory, the narrative, but the sky no longer tries to control it. For the first time, you realize that peace doesn't depend on fixing what moves. It depends on remembering what doesn't. This revelation changes everything because it dismantles the story of opposition you've carried for so long. You see that the mind isn't the villain it once appeared to be. It's not an intruder in consciousness, but a misunderstood tool. Precise when guided, chaotic when left unchecked. The problem was never the existence of the mind, but the absence of the observer who could hold it. In that recognition, something like compassion begins to rise. You understand why the mind fought so hard to stay in control. It wasn't malicious, it was afraid. Every defense mechanism, every argument, every obsession with order or meaning, all of it was an attempt to protect a fragile sense of self. The mind tried to build a shelter from the unknown, unaware that the unknown is the only true home awareness ever had. You begin to sense that the enemy was only a frightened child running the machinery of thought. And when you see that clearly, resistance softens. The observer doesn't try to silence the mind anymore. It simply listens without taking sides. Thought, emotion, sensation all become allowed movements within a larger stillness. In that stillness, perception sharpens. You notice details that used to slip by. The texture of silence between sounds, the way a single breath seems to connect inner and outer space. Even tension feels different, not as something to escape, but as energy seeking form. The old boundary between spiritual and ordinary starts to dissolve. Washing a cup becomes no less sacred than sitting in meditation, because both are windows through which awareness watches itself unfold. But this clarity has a limit, and here lies the subtle danger. Once the observer begins to awaken, the mind quickly adapts. It learns the language of presence. It starts saying things like, "I'm just observing," or "Nothing can touch me now." The ego evolves. It starts pretending to be awareness itself. And in that performance, true observation turns into avoidance disguised as transcendence. This stage is tricky because it feels like progress. You appear calmer, less reactive, more detached. But inside there's a quiet numbness, a sterile peace. You stop engaging deeply with life because you mistake emotional distance for spiritual maturity. The world still moves, but you hover above it untouched, and slowly, unconsciously disconnected. That's the shadow side of awakening, spiritual avoidance. The belief that detachment equals freedom, but real freedom doesn't float above life, it lives inside it. It's found in the heart that can feel fully without drowning, in the awareness that can witness joy and grief with the same quiet reverence. To recognize this distortion, you must bring the same neutral observation you once used for pain and apply it to your own awakened state. Notice when presence becomes performance. Notice the subtle pride that says, "I've transcended that." If you can observe even that without shame, you break the illusion again, the illusion of being beyond. The moment of internal revelation, then, is not a single event. It's a living process, a rhythm between seeing and forgetting, opening and contracting. Each return to awareness is another small revelation, proof that consciousness learns by circling itself. And each time you see the mind for what it is, a tool, not a master, the observer grows steadier, more natural. You begin to live with both, the human and the infinite, thought and silence, form and formlessness. But this clarity leads to a new threshold, one even subtler than the fear of pain. Because once awareness stabilizes, there's a temptation to believe the work is done. You might start mistaking indifference for balance, confusing numbness with peace, and that's where the next illusion unfolds. The fatal mistake of the pseudo-awakened, the moment when detachment becomes a wall instead of a window. There's a moment on nearly every path of awakening when stillness becomes so familiar that it begins to feel like safety. You stop reacting, stop chasing, stop needing to prove or defend. At first it feels like peace, a long-awaited release from the constant noise of emotion and thought. But if you listen closely, that stillness can start to harden. What was once openness becomes a quiet, invisible shell. This is the fatal mistake of the pseudo-awakened, confusing detachment with freedom. It happens slowly. You start to believe that spiritual maturity means being untouched by life. You pride yourself on calmness, on being beyond the world's dramas. Emotions in others appear chaotic, almost primitive. Pain feels unnecessary, joy suspiciously fragile. You become the silent observer of it all, serene, centered, and quietly removed. On the surface, it looks like mastery. Inside, it's often isolation, because what has happened isn't awakening, it's withdrawal. The mind has learned to wear enlightenment as armor. It's an understandable trap. After years of identifying with thoughts and emotions, you finally discover the relief of stillness. You don't want to lose it, so you start avoiding anything that threatens it. Intense relationships, uncertainty, vulnerability, love. You build your life around maintaining that inner calm. But awareness that needs protection isn't free, it's fragile. True presence doesn't fear disturbance. It knows that even chaos unfolds within its field. The silence of real awakening isn't brittle. It's alive. It can hold laughter and tears without choosing one over the other. The pseudo-awakened, however, live inside a conceptual stillness, an idea of peace rather than peace itself. You can feel the difference. Conceptual stillness resists movement. Living stillness includes it. One hides from life, the other breathes it in. To see this, watch what happens when life disrupts your balance. Someone challenges your beliefs, confronts your indifference, or awakens an old wound you thought you'd outgrown. In that instant, the truth of your awakening is revealed. If you feel irritation, defensiveness, or superiority, they don't understand. They're not conscious enough. The ego has simply changed masks. It's now the spiritual one. The pseudo-awakened mind loves to separate itself from others. It secretly feeds on the identity of being the one who sees while others sleep. It's the subtlest form of ego because it hides inside insight. The pride is not loud, it's polished. It sounds like compassion, but carries the faint taste of distance, the quiet belief that you're beyond the human mess everyone else is still tangled in. But the deeper truth is this: if your awakening makes you less human, it's not awakening, it's escape. Real awareness doesn't float above suffering, it walks through it with eyes open. It doesn't reject the noise of life. It listens deeply enough to hear the silence beneath it. To be fully awake is to be fully available, to joy, to loss, to contradiction. When the observer matures, it no longer needs to withdraw from feeling. It understands that awareness can hold pain without being destroyed by it. The awakened one doesn't turn away from tears. They become the witness in the tears. They know that presence isn't absence, it's inclusion. And yet this realization doesn't come easily. The ego, sensing it might dissolve, begins to whisper new stories. You've transcended emotion. You don't need to feel. That voice sounds wise, but it's just fear disguised as enlightenment. Fear of re-entering the human experience it once suffered through, but you can't awaken from humanity. You awaken within it. You don't become less personal. You become more real. Presence doesn't reject the person. It illuminates it, softens it, allows it to exist without pretending to be all that you are. If you watch closely, you'll see that the pseudo-awakened state is brittle because it's built on separation. The moment you feel something too raw or chaotic, the illusion cracks. And that crack, and uncomfortable as it is grace entering. It's the invitation to go beyond the sterile calm of detachment into the living pulse of true awareness. That pulse is not neat or quiet. It's the trembling aliveness that beats beneath everything. Laughter mixed with grief, joy rising from loss, stillness vibrating inside motion. It's what happens when you stop trying to control experience and allow yourself to be experience. The pseudo-awakened mind fears this surrender because it thinks it will lose its clarity. But the opposite is true. When you allow yourself to re-enter life fully, clarity deepens. Awareness stops being an escape route and becomes a companion, not a place you retreat to, but the lens through which you live. And that's the real threshold of awakening, the turning point where the mind's need for control dissolves, and the observer realizes that it never had to hold anything together at all. The flow of life was never a threat. It was the expression of the same awareness you thought you had to protect. From here, the path begins to move differently. No longer about silence against sound or stillness against motion. It's about coherence, when observation and experience start to align, and the fear of losing control fades into something even deeper, the freedom of no longer needing it. There comes a moment when awareness, once fragile and searching, begins to turn inward on itself, not in isolation, but in recognition. It sees that what it's been observing all along is not separate from what it is. The division between observer and observed, between the one who sees and what is seen, starts to blur. This is the turning point of consciousness, the quiet revolution where the illusion of control begins to unravel. Up until now, the mind has acted as though it were the gatekeeper of reality. It sorts, interprets, defends, and justifies, all in an effort to preserve its imagined authority. It believes that without its control, everything would fall apart. But when the observer awakens fully, a radical insight breaks through that illusion. Control was never real. Reality has always been moving on its own, effortlessly. You can feel this turning point more than you can think it. It begins as a subtle shift in gravity. Life stops being something that happens to you and becomes something that happens as you. The air feels different, denser, as if the world itself were breathing through you instead of around you. The sense of separation, me here, life out there, starts to dissolve like mist in sunlight. At first, the mind resists. It doesn't know how to function without hierarchy. It's been trained to lead, to plan, to solve. But now, as consciousness stabilizes in awareness rather than identification, the mind's control mechanisms feel heavy, unnecessary. You catch yourself trying to manage every moment, and then suddenly you stop. The compulsion to interfere weakens. Life continues without your supervision, and nothing falls apart. That discovery is both liberating and disorienting. For the first time, you realize that existence doesn't need your permission to unfold. You don't breathe yourself. Breath happens. You don't create awareness. Awareness is already here, self-sustaining. The more you try to manage it, the more friction appears. When you stop resisting, movement becomes graceful, like a river remembering its course. It's here that consciousness begins to reveal its intelligence, not the analytical intelligence of the mind, but a deeper coherence. Every experience, every challenge, every silence starts to feel perfectly placed. You start to see patterns that once looked random. Conversations arrive at the right time. Encounters teach without intention. The world doesn't appear as chaos anymore. It appears as communication. This is not magical thinking. It's perceptual alignment. The observer has stopped fragmenting reality through judgment. Instead of dividing everything into categories of good or bad, you begin to sense an underlying harmony connecting opposites. Pain and joy, loss and creation. They're not enemies. They're complementary notes in the same frequency field. Consciousness recognizes its own rhythm moving through contrast. The mind, however, doesn't surrender easily. It keeps whispering that it's dangerous to trust this flow. If you stop controlling, it says, you'll lose direction. But the opposite happens. Without the constant interference of fear, decisions arise naturally, without the strain of effort. You notice that clarity doesn't come from thinking harder, it comes from listening more deeply. There's an intelligence beneath thought, a current that moves through intuition, synchronicity, and stillness. You've felt it before in fleeting moments, when time seemed to pause, when a solution appeared out of nowhere, when silence spoke louder than words. The turning point is realizing that this intelligence isn't a visitor. It's your natural state when the mind relaxes. Something in you begins to trust this rhythm, not blindly but experientially. You test it, and it keeps proving itself reliable. You step back, and life steps forward with precision. You surrender control, and meaning starts to emerge on its own. What once looked like coincidence now feels like choreography. This turning point changes how you relate to fear. You start to see that fear's only function was to maintain the illusion of control. The mind feared losing itself, not realizing that it was never separate from what it feared. When awareness finally sees this, fear dissolves, not by conquest, but by exposure. You see through it, and it vanishes like a shadow in light. As this recognition deepens, your relationship to identity shifts again. You stop trying to be the observer. Even that becomes unnecessary. Awareness doesn't need a title. It's simply the space in which everything arises, including the idea of an I who is observing. This is the true humility of awakening, not claiming enlightenment, but disappearing into what has always been awake. Yet this expansion brings another challenge. When perception and presence begin to align, a subtle question emerges, not from the mind but from somewhere deeper. If fear has lost its purpose and control is no longer needed, what sustains movement now? What animates the unfolding of life when there is no one left to steer it? That question points to the next passage, the forbidden alignment, where consciousness discovers that what it once called life and what it calls self were never two different things. There is a moment when consciousness stops trying to ascend and instead begins to integrate. It no longer seeks to rise above the world, but to move through it without distortion. That movement, when perception and presence finally align, is what many mystics feared to speak of directly. It's the forbidden alignment, the state in which awareness sees not from above life, but as life. Until now, the journey has been upward, a gradual unbinding from thought, emotion, and identification. The observer separated itself from the chaos to see clearly. But clarity, once matured, must descend again. Because true understanding isn't found in escape, it's found in union. The eye that once watched from a distance now realizes it was never outside what it observed. This alignment feels like a paradox because it breaks the structure the mind depends on. The mind sees only in contrast, self and other, inside and outside, observer and observed. But the moment consciousness aligns with itself, those opposites collapse. There is no longer a border where perception ends and reality begins. Awareness recognizes that it is the field in which everything happens. Imagine two mirrors facing each other. For a while they reflect separate images, the observer watching the observed, but at a certain angle, reflection folds into reflection and depth becomes infinite. That infinite depth is the essence of forbidden alignment. It's what happens when awareness stops looking at itself as an object and begins to experience itself as the totality of seeing. At first, this realization feels like nothingness. The mind interprets it as loss of self, loss of perspective, loss of meaning. But if you stay in that apparent emptiness long enough, something extraordinary emerges, a subtle vibration of coherence. Everything, from the smallest thought to the motion of the stars, seems to hum with the same pulse. You can sense the architecture of existence, not as a theory but as direct resonance. This is not the bliss the mind imagined enlightenment would bring. It's quieter, deeper, a serenity without triumph. The peace here is not personal. It doesn't belong to you. It doesn't rise and fall with circumstance. It simply is, steady like gravity. And as it deepens, fear begins to lose its meaning. Because fear's function, to protect a separate self, has no use when separation has dissolved. In this alignment, awareness no longer chases understanding. It becomes understanding itself. Perception stops being an act and becomes a state of coherence. Every event, every encounter, every silence is seen as movement within a single continuum. What once felt fragmented, thoughts, emotions, memories, are recognized as waves of the same ocean. The forbidden aspect of this alignment comes from how it threatens the mind's final illusion, the idea that awakening must keep a witness. The mind wants a center, even in enlightenment. It wants to say, I am the one who is aware, but when perception and presence align completely, even that witness disappears. There is only awareness aware of itself, without a middleman, and to the mind, that feels like death. But it isn't death. It's the end of distortion, the end of the lens that bent reality into subject and object. When that distortion dissolves, life becomes astonishingly direct. You don't experience awareness anymore. You are experience, immediate, unmediated, whole. It's as if the entire cosmos is breathing through you and you through it, with no boundary in between. Even your thoughts begin to sound different. They're lighter, less territorial. The mind continues to function as it speaks, plans, remembers, but it no longer commands. It serves quietly, translating the infinite into the language of the finite. And from this state, love begins to make new sense. Not the emotional surge that seeks or clings, but the recognition that everything has always been included. You see the same awareness looking back at you from every pair of eyes, every sound, every silence. The walls between beings dissolve, not because you believe in unity, but because you can no longer deny it. The old impulse to escape suffering loses its power here. Because what you used to call suffering is now understood as friction. The creative tension that allows awareness to know itself through contrast. Light needs shadow to be visible. Consciousness needs form to feel its depth. When alignment is full, nothing is rejected, not even limitation. This is the closure of the great loop. The observer now understands what the mind avoided. It sees that avoidance was never protection, only delay. Everything you once resisted was trying to bring you here, to this seamless point where the inner and outer meet, where seeing and being merge. But alignment, as complete as it feels, is not the end. Because once awareness recognizes itself everywhere, the old game of illusion can't continue. The separation that fueled the story of self dissolves. What follows is irreversible, a point of no return where consciousness steps fully into its own reflection, and the illusion of being the seeker finally breaks apart. There's a moment on the inner path when something irreversible happens. Not an explosion, not a revelation in lights and sound, but a quiet collapse. The scaffolding that once held your sense of me begins to fall away, and for the first time there's no effort to rebuild it. This is the point of no return, the instant when the illusion loses its ability to fully convince you again. The mind still speaks, but its authority is gone. Thoughts continue to rise, but they no longer grip. You can almost feel the space between perception and reaction expanding. Life unfolds, the same people, the same problems, the same rhythms, yet something invisible has shifted. The one who used to interpret, defend, and compare has dissolved into transparency. You look at a thought like you might look at a bird passing overhead. It comes, it goes, it leaves no mark. This is not detachment in the cold sense of disinterest. It's intimacy, a deeper kind, the kind that doesn't need to possess or control. You no longer relate to reality. You are reality relating to itself. The distinction between inner and outer becomes less meaningful. When anger arises in another, you feel it as energy moving through the shared field, not as an attack. When beauty appears, it feels like remembering something you've always known. At first, this shift feels like freedom. The weight of judgment lifts, and the noise of inner conflict quiets. But then, something even stranger happens. The mind, accustomed to being the center of gravity, realizes it has nowhere left to stand. It searches for reference points and finds none. There's a subtle panic. If I'm not the one thinking, deciding, doing, what am I? The old I tries to reassemble itself, to become spiritual, to label this experience as my awakening. But the truth keeps undoing every new identity the mind builds. It's disorienting because you can't go back to believing in separation, yet you're not fully accustomed to living without it. It's like stepping off the edge of an old world into vast, open space. You begin to sense that all the effort to become conscious was consciousness pretending to chase itself. The seeker dissolves into what it was seeking, and that realization ends the game. This is why there's no going back. Once you've seen that awareness doesn't need an owner, the illusion of ownership never feels real again. You can play along, use I and me for conversation, navigate the world's practicalities, but somewhere deep down, you know it's a kind of theater. And yet the play doesn't lose meaning. It becomes more vivid, more alive, precisely because you know it's a play. Here, paradox rules everything. You feel smaller than ever, humble, transparent, groundless, and at the same time, infinitely vast. Every sound, every sensation, every fleeting moment is experienced as yourself, not metaphorically but literally. The wind brushing your skin is no longer outside. The thought forming in your head is no longer inside. Yet there's only the immediacy of being. But the point of no return isn't always serene. When the old boundaries collapse, everything that was repressed begins to surface. Grief, rage, fear, memories unprocessed. Awareness allows them all, but they arrive with the force of lifetimes. What once looked like enlightenment begins to resemble undoing. You realize that awakening isn't an escape from humanity, but the total embrace of it. The divine doesn't hover above human experience. It breathes through it. In this dissolution, you see that love is not emotion, but recognition. Love is what remains when nothing is separate enough to be loved or unloved. It's the natural condition of oneness, remembering itself through the shifting faces of existence. That's why, after the point of no return, even pain feels sacred. Not because you enjoy it, but because you see that it's also part of the living whole. Time begins to move differently here. Days unfold with a kind of quiet inevitability. Choices happen, yet there's no longer the burden of choosing. Actions arise without a doer. You witness life continuing in perfect order without the old sense of control. What once felt like surrender now feels like nature. And through it all, one realization keeps deepening. You were never trying to awaken as a mind. You were never the character trying to understand awareness. You were always awareness remembering itself through the dream of a character. The seeker was a necessary fiction, a story consciousness told so it could rediscover its own presence. When that story ends, nothing dramatic occurs. The sky doesn't split open and the world doesn't change shape. What changes is subtler. The sense of distance between you and everything else disappears. What remains is ordinary life illuminated from within, the simple, wordless knowing that you were never lost. And from that knowing, the movement of life continues, effortless, coherent, self-aware. The illusion has served its purpose and quietly dissolves, leaving only the clarity that has always been there, patiently waiting beneath the noise. From here, the final unfolding begins, the silent witness stepping fully into life's game again, but this time as consciousness awake to itself, no longer chasing what was never a part. When the observer fully awakens, life no longer feels like something to fix. It feels like something to witness. The mind still moves, but its movements are transparent, like wind through open space. You understand now that what your mind avoided was never your enemy. It was the doorway. Every shadow you faced turned into light the moment you stopped resisting it. Healing wasn't about escape. It was about presence. If you've reached this point, it means something inside you recognized the truth beneath the words. The part of you that has always been watching, quietly waiting to be remembered. Write in the comments, "I see from the silence now, so I know you arrived here fully aware." And if this journey stirred something in you, choose one of the videos appearing on your screen. Each continues the exploration of conscious seeing, where observation becomes creation and awareness learns to live as itself.